Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill advised discussions of visual media on a non visual podcast, and so much more. Although, actually, not. It's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on. And I know what this means now. Through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast, in which I, your host Tylor, know a lot about this book and lie to Greg about whether I'm going to edit things out of the podcast. I actually will. And I am joined by Greg. Greg, you are someone who has not experienced a lot of the Wheel of Time, although I guess you're up to a third of it at this point. That's quite a bit compared to most book series. But this is kind of your first opportunity to have a full-on Forsaken chapter, where the goal is to paint them as horrible human beings and give you a little bit of an insight into how they got to be such horrible human beings, and then dangle a bunch of plot threads that we know will be resolved sometime in the next 1 to 10 books. What is your impression of this type of chapter? Is it something that you kind of see analogs to in other things that you read? Because I know you're so well read. Or does this feel like something Robert Jordan is doing that is different or unique in some way compared to the other, things that you're familiar with? I want kind of your broad chapter overview before we dive into the specifics.
Well, outside of our, first, hi, how are you? Nice to meet you. Good to see you. Welcome back to another week, folks. We are, of course, talking about Chapter 6 in Book 6. Hey, look at that.
Nice.
Called Lord of Chaos. It was a tough chapter for me. So as I started to say in our non-content creator lives, I did see you yesterday, and I was like,
Yeah.
I don't know if I understood anything we read this week. And I will say that was kind of my overwhelming feeling as I read this is I understood kind of what was happening in the scenes, but I was like, I feel like this is working on levels that I'm not even beginning to perceive because I don't really remember who these characters are. They mentioned Samael a lot, and that's when I was like, oh, I remember that one. But, it felt to me like the rest of these were new. To answer the broader question then, I think a lot of fantasy, not that I read fantasy, really does like to give some focus over to the villains at times. And I think I always hear it explained as the writers just really love writing awful people, right? And in Star Wars book world, there's often a lot of Darth Vader books because it's really fun to write somebody kind of tortured and twisted and so on. Actually, right now there's a new comic book series of Kylo Ren kind of between 8 and 9 at the height of his evilness. And that strikes me as part of what's going on here is it's kind of delicious to watch a bad person be bad. So even if I don't perceive of it all, I can appreciate that Robert Jordan is probably like, yes, let's do a little of this instead of these namby-pamby teenagers and get a little taste of something different.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, especially given that when we think about how Robert Jordan sits kind of in fantasy world, it's interesting to think George R.R. Martin does a lot of evil, horrible villains, but very seldom writes from their perspective. And someone like Tolkien, again, horrible black, not white characters, but I don't think we ever get a evil character's perspective in maybe the entire Tolkien universe. And that, I haven't read the Silmarillion and things like that. Don't at me, please. But it's pretty rare in like traditional fantasy. And so I wonder kind of where this sits in, I know film, the answer is like the 1970s when you had kind of this new wave of directors coming in and you had The Godfather and, you know, the anti-hero really became central to that. I'm very curious where Robert Jordan sits in fantasy land in terms of how much he got into the villain's head relative to other people of his era. I don't know my fantasy quite that well, and I know you don't read fantasy, but that was something I was kind of left wondering about after reading these chapters. This chapter is kind of how much is he doing something that had been done before and how much of this is very different from what had come before. I don't quite know the answer to that question.
Too far beyond my in Fantasyland he sits near the spinning teacups joke, but I'll still go for it. I will still take it. But no, nothing? That got nothing from you. Oh, come on. I actually honestly was like, wait, did Tyler's connection drop? That's how confident I felt in that joke. You know, it's certainly not something I know either. And, you know, it also, I think the 70s is right as all those allusions you made. And then I think of it as like the prestige TV era where you get the rise of the Tony Soprano and the Walter White. Yeah. And, you know, it seems like those are particularly kind of tumultuous moments in history, right? We're talking kind of 70s upheaval with the kind of spinning out of Vietnam and then the kind of post 9/11 moment, roughly speaking. I think The Sopranos might predate 9/11 slightly. I don't really know my Sopranos well.
That sounds right, because I feel like I remember them either editing out from some of the seasons in the intro shot, taking out the Twin Towers. So I think that is right about the right time.
Yeah, so that seems to me then that, like, well, what's going on that's inspiring Robert Jordan? And, you know, the cycle of creating a book takes a little longer. So in some ways it could be reacting to the same kind of terrible end of the 70s, early 80s. You know, and I know you've mentioned before that he had some post-Vietnam feelings to work through. It also strikes me, you know, the fact that this is an insidious evil. I mean, not to get too real world, but it seems like as I think of 80s history, we were looking for where are the villains? Things are not happening exactly as we think they should be, and who can we blame? And that didn't always kind of reveal itself in a way like a chapter with the evil Forsaken can. So maybe it's kind of reacting to some of those forces, or it's just like the complete opposite. We're living in the 90s. Let's just ignore everything good happening and see what's terrible.
Well, I managed to get this intro to last almost 7 minutes, which means that hopefully we will get the episode over 30. Y'all, Greg didn't quite feel like he locked into this chapter, and I feel like all of the exciting parts of this chapter are foreshadowing that I can't say anything about. This might be an extremely short one. But you know what's not going to be extremely short? Probably this summary, as I try to pack in all of the important details that I can't say much about later on. We begin with Samael cautiously stepping into someone else's turf, something that he normally avoids. Graendal has kept him informed on the meetings with Demandred and the other Forsaken that we have witnessed in the prologue, and it is Graendal's palace that apparently he has entered, which is opulent and filled with compulsioned musicians and also people who are performing acrobatics, some of it not entirely PG-13. Samael thinks that all of this is wasteful and thinks about how using compulsion this much basically destroys people to some degree, but Samael does note that Graendal is the best at this type of compulsion. Samael turned to the light, apparently thinking that it was turned from the light, thinking that it was a lost cause, and thinks that Graendal brought a number of people from across the Aiel Waste, and then Graendal begins talking about these performers, and we learn about the 7-year ruling cycle in the country of Shara. Samael at this point wonders why Graendal took the time to bring these individuals over from Shara, as she is then describing all of the king's family who are also her servants. Samael notes that famous servants are a risk, and he thinks that she is taking a number of unnecessary risks, but he also marvels marvels at her skills with compulsion when she shows off the disguise that she uses in order to avoid being noticed by anyone and being caught out. He holds Sidene, it's noted, to avoid her using any compulsion on him. At this point, she teases him about his height, causing him to insist that Randall Thor has been lucky so far, but Graendal seems to think that luck couldn't carry him this far, and she notes that Ishamael insisted that the dragon could have been turned to the shadow in past turnings of the wheel, and that might be what the Dark One intends this time. At this point, Samael asks after Asmodean, Lanfear, and Mogadien, all of whom are missing, and they debate whether or not Rand killed them, and Graendal seems extremely confident that both Asmodean and Lanfear are dead, causing Samael to ask if Graendal is holding back any of the details from their previous missions. At this point, Graendal marvels at Rand's success, despite seemingly being untrained when they all woke up, and then Samael insists that Rand is worthless and that his alliances are shaky other than the Aiel, and at this point he references the old Aiel and says how strange it is that the new Aiel are so different than those in ancient times. Graendal then proposes battling Rand Link, but Samael immediately refuses this, and then she reports that Semirhage missed their last meeting, and she pleads once again that she wants the Forsaken cooperating, and Samael sends a warning to Demandred rather than any sign of cooperation. We get more details about Shara, specifically that they are breeding channelers and then kill the young male channelers at 21, and then eventually Samael asks that, or when all of this is being described, Samael counters by asking, but do they bind themselves like criminals, which causes Graendal to flinch for a moment and then realize what he means, but we don't get to know what he means. She then reveals that there is a hidden power in Shara behind the scenes, and Samael says that he is trying not to provoke Rand, but he refuses to abandon Ilion and says he will strike back if necessary. Eventually, she agrees to meet in Ilion if he is still there, and he departs. At this point, we shift into Grendal's point of view as she wonders if her effort at acquiring the Sharans was worth it. She thinks that Samael is too direct to pay too much attention to all of her hints, but we know that this is not entirely true from his POV. She thinks that Samael is, she thinks that he is scared, and she has plans to use Samael to kill Rand and then have him take the blame if the Dark One is upset about it. She notes that she recently learned that Mizana is in the White Tower, and then Lord Iderald apparently has arrived, and she becomes a decrepit old woman, and thinks that the Dark One has all but promised her the title of Nameless. Finally, we jump into Semirhage's head, who laments the lack of a sterile environment while a patient demands to know who she is. Semirhage asks who she is instead, and simulates the pain centers of the individual's brain. Semirhage then thinks how pathetic current Aes Sedai are, and how sad it is that all of the structures that have been around since her time have always punished her for her cruelty, and she thinks that she was able to manipulate so many people during the War of Power, and she reveled in how afraid they were when they saw her years later. After a number of screams, Cabriana, which is the Aes Sedai's name, gives her name but nothing else, and eventually Semirhage manipulates first the pleasure center and then eventually the pain center, leaving her in significant pain as she leaves the room. At this point, Semirhage reports the name to Shaidar Heron, who orders that she get every bit of information as quickly as possible, and then he disappears. Her second patient is Cabriana's warder, and he apparently is feeling Cabriana's pain. She then uses the pleasure center on him exclusively and begins wondering what makes Shaidar Heron different from other Murdrail, and is also basically thinking about the status of Asmodean and Lanfear, and she wonders if the Dark One wants Rand to be the Nameless, but then she looks down and notices that the warder has killed himself and the Aes Sedai is begging, and she thinks that this will be far too quick and far too easy. So, I know I've said before that Robert Jordan doesn't dwell on the dark, but for 20 pages, boy did he. What was your feeling on our first kind of real Forsaken chapter?
In addition to what I said before,
right.
I thought the point of what was shared here was just to show how far beyond the pale these characters are. And it's not really like a competition to see who's the darkest, but the idea that you have these awful contortions happening like as the centerpiece of the room, to me is symbolic of it all, right? These people who against their will are forced to essentially become naughty statues and are bent at unnatural angles and clearly suffering. There's I forget, I think it's the start of the 7th Harry Potter. It's some late Harry Potter where they start with a professor. It must be the 7th. A professor
right.
from Hogwarts being strangled by Nagini in the middle of the Death Eaters, and like nobody's talking about it, and she's like pleading for her life darkly, and then they
Or is this the 6th one and Harry Potter experiences it through like legilimency or whatever it's called?
I'm not
One
sure.
of those.
One of those late Harry Potter books. And so it kind of that's kind of the image I had more from the film, is just kind of this kind of slowly rotating object. I mean, this would not make a Harry Potter film, but this slowly rotating awful object that's kind of distracting attention and yet not getting any attention. And that kind of central tension to this chapter seemed right, that all of these incredibly awful things are like day-to-day business to these characters. It's like, oh yeah, she just does that, and he just does this, and like, yeah, that's just their things, like, yep, I'm the torture guy, that's the lady who likes to manipulate brains, whatever it is. And it's all very dark, but so pedestrian in its expression, which somehow makes it even darker.
Yeah. Given that, I think what I want to do early on is try to make sure that, given that you have kind of had memory lapses at times in this book, not trying to talk too much smack, but I think that is accurate. What I would love to do is, before we kind of dive into the blow-by-blow of this chapter, which I expect will be very brief, I just briefly want to kind of talk through all of these surviving Forsaken, and maybe even a few of them who have died, so that I can count all the way to 13. And that way we can kind of make sure that we have a good marker, as you're saying, even if it's just something like this person is the blank one. Make sure that we kind of are following the names in a chapter like this, where Forsaken names fly fast and furious. Okay? So, when we are thinking of surviving Forsaken, Greg is getting out his notebook. I love this. Mogadien, we know, is alive and is currently being held by Elaine and Nynaeve in Saladar. It's worth noting she is known as the Spider. She is the one who kind of stays in the background and very seldom attacks openly. She is known as one of the best at manipulating the realm of dreams. I think Lanfear is the only other one who would have as much or more skill at Teleron Riod.
And just to, again, cross over to our personal lives, when are we recording? But we maybe just got the first 3 episodes of Season 3 of The Wheel of Time. Yep. And one of the things that I was reminded in some previously on scenes is that Mogadien is a woman.
Yes.
The name does not have a kind of traditional feminine form, so I think my head goes that way.
Got it.
Those rules of names do not apply to any of the Forsaken. That's just bad romance language expectations in my head. So.
That is correct. The fun thing is Robert Jordan isn't quite at Tolkien levels of linguistics, but he definitely plays enough with them all being words in the old tongue that they don't quite follow any sort of English or, as you say, romance language kind of rules. That's absolutely right. It also worth noting, if we're crossing the streams, in the television show there are 8 Forsaken. In the books there are 13, although several of them have already fallen. I want to continue doing all of the female Forsaken, right? So Mogadien, currently captured by Elaine and Nynaeve.
All the single ladies. Oh, sorry.
You're good.
Continue doing the...
Lanfear is a big old double question mark. Whatever ideas you have about Moraine potentially coming back presumably also apply to Lanfear. I feel like she is probably the one Forsaken who I don't need to describe in more detail. You got Lanfear. We also have Mizana. We have almost nothing on Mizana thus far. We learned in a previous chapter that she was once an academic who was forced to be a teacher instead of doing research, and that broke her. And we now know that she is in the White Tower. End of story. That's all we got on her. We also have in this...
I think you already made this joke, but did not get tenure. Check. Got it.
Yeah, 100%. we then have Graendal, who is our POV in this chapter. Graendal I always think of as the compulsion one with the servants, right? When I think of Graendal, I always think of a scene like the one we got here. She's always guiding people through her palace of all of the compulsioned people doing weird stuff just for her. The other way to kind of remember her is she is definitely the most hedonistic of the Forsaken. All of them seem to have plots and plans, and her plan seems to be enjoy myself as much as possible. I am then missing one female Forsaken, I believe. Semirhage, we have not talked about yet. The other POV character from this chapter. Semirhage, I always remember as the clinically insane one. She obviously, I think the way that I often think of her is the psychologist. She was the healer in the old days, and so she's able to manipulate the brain. That's what she's doing in this chapter. She is the one who likes hurting people more than basically any of the others that we have had described.
It's spelled weird.
Yes, it is. To the point that I am not sure if she arrives in the television show, if it will be like Semirhage or something. Who knows? Oh, there was some name in the third season that ruined me, and I can't say it correctly ever again. But I don't remember what it is. I believe that is all of our female Forsaken who are surviving.
5.
That sounds right.
Okay.
Male Forsaken, we have obviously Samael. The way I always remember him is he's the one who went to the dark because he's short. I know his story on himself in this chapter is that he went to the dark one because he thought that the light side was lost, but the number of times he focuses on Graendal, Thor, and Lews Therin being a head taller than him means he definitely went to the dark because he's short. You can also now remember him as the one with the Scottish accent if you're watching the television show. He is in Ilion at the moment. Rand has all of his forces pointed directly at him in Ilion. We also have, as surviving male Aes Sedai, we have Demandred, who we do not know his current location, and in fact, if we believe her, Graendal says that she does not know his location in this chapter, and she is trying to figure out where he is at. He was the one who was basically always second to Lews Therin. So I always kind of remember him as like the second best general and the second best fighter and the second best channeler, and that's kind of what broke him and sent him to the dark. We also, at this point, I believe that is all of our original Forsaken in their classic forms. We also know that there are 2 Forsaken, Osengar and Erengar, who as of the prologue have been brought back to life, but we do not know which Forsaken they originally were before being brought back to life. And I believe that is our full list of Forsaken. Write angrily in the comments if I have forgotten anyone.
We have comments?
We do. We have gotten a grand total of 2 of them, and one was one of our hosts telling us that he was an excellent host.
And again, I'm taking serious that you said we are not sure, but like a candidate for Osengar and Asengar would be the fact that we met 2 Forsaken in Eye of the World, and they were kind of burned off quickly like they were nothing.
Absolutely.
So those would be candidates for coming
Yes,
back.
so I think we got this kind of dead Forsaken roundup at the beginning of the book. So remember, anyone killed by balefire is potentially not eligible. So the update at the beginning of the book was that we knew that Belal could not be because he was killed with balefire, Ravin could not be brought back because he was killed with balefire, and Asmodean could be brought back but would not because he betrayed the Dark One. So I think our list of who could potentially be brought back is those 2 characters that you highlighted from the beginning, plus Lanfear, if it turns out she is actually dead, plus Ishamael, who did not die by balefire.
And was the one pretending to be the...
That is correct. Exactly. Given that roundup, what other questions can I answer for you before we do blow by blow from this chapter so you feel like I am not going over things that are still somewhat confusing before we're breaking down the details?
I guess I will just say, I'm going to ask you to just say that's okay or that's not okay. So
Yeah.
my kind of general attitude to trying to track these Forsaken and thinking through them is just to recognize that they are all out there. They are at times, I mean, they're like a really dark episode of Survivor, right? There are some in alliances, there are some in factions working against other ones, but they are all kind of separate and just working to cause chaos wherever they are.
That is 100% accurate. I think the one thing that I would say, one of my favorite games that I played when I was reading this book for the first time, and one thing that I think the comments on the internet have convinced me is a very common thing to enjoy, is as you are keeping an eye on these Forsaken, make sure that you kind of remember who they are and what their personality is a little bit, right? Like Samael refuses to back down, and Demandred always wants to one-up everyone else, and Mogadien is someone who wants to stay in the background. Like those kind of details, because the most fun game to play with the Forsaken is every time you meet a new character, go, oh, do they sound too much like any of the other characters that we've met so far? Right? Like that's the thing that I think is worth playing at this point. Is we basically at this point have, I think, 6 or 7 living Forsaken potentially, as well as 2 brought back to life. And that kind of makes us have a checklist of who could these people be, right? In the same way that if Ravin had shown up as Morghase's lover, but Matt hadn't found him out after 5 pages, guessing games of who is this Gabriel guy is the kind of thing we should be doing with every person who shows up on our doorstep. Just hypothetically, as an example, like Mazrim Tayyim or Davrim Bashir or any Aes Sedai who arrives now that we know that one of the Forsaken is at the White Tower.
I like that. That's helpful and good information. The other piece I want to just confirm is this opens with one of them just kind of making a casual gateway like Rand does, right? So we should just assume kind of the rules of travel don't apply. I mean, there are so many exceptions to the rules of travel. They kind of don't apply to anybody, but...
What I would say is that the Forsaken 100% have gateways, can use them in what right now certainly seems like unlimited ways. Rand is at the point where he is creating gateways sometimes when he kind of taps into his like oldie loose therany knowledge, but in terms of what he kind of knows how to do in his own like thoughts and ways of acting, the best he can pull off is what he's described as skimming, where he creates basically a middle place and then kind of sits there for a minute and then arrives somewhere else. So he's kind of in between in terms of the rules of travel. He can definitely get where he wants, but it might be slower than the Forsaken are currently doing. No other channelers other than the Forsaken and Rand have shown any inclination of an ability to travel like this. So I think you're right to say for a certain class of channeler, they can go, it seems like, anywhere they want, anytime they want. Rand is a little more restricted than that. Everyone else is completely in the dark about this power even existing.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that because it does seem like no Aes Sedai has mentioned it or understood it, really.
I think we maybe had one, like, Suan Sancha referencing things that can no longer be done and said, like, maybe you'll rediscover traveling someday. But, like, other than them knowing it was once theoretically possible, that's their level of understanding of this.
Cool. That's what I got. Let's walk through some chapter.
Excellent. I just wanted to start with kind of it almost felt like a personality difference, but just Graendal's willingness to say, that is a thing I want, let me compulsion it, versus Samael, who seems like very deliberate and thoughtful, and every kind of person, he doesn't regard them as people, but he regards them as resources and is very careful to not waste resources. And I thought it's really interesting to me how Robert Jordan does a good job in this chapter of making sure that you know that his evil has degrees and types and ways. And I think if his thesis for this chapter is, I know this is a world of black and white, but there's a lot of shades of black, I think he's accomplishing that well.
Sounds right to me, and it's the easiest thing for me to bounce off of is Star Wars, where it's like good guys, bad guys, right? And that's gotten more complicated at different times, but it does feel like he's particularly noting. I mean, Shades of Black is nice. That should be your album title, I think, or something like that. But I do, I kind of think of it as, kind of everybody has their own principles, right? Like they're all kind of lawful evil. It's just that none of the laws match up.
Yeah.
They all follow their own twisted value set. They have their own lines that they won't cross and so on.
I think I think Semirhage might actually be just pure chaotic evil in every single way, but we can get to that when we get to her POV. I think the only other thing that I had to note kind of early on in this chapter is that it seems like Samael notes very quickly that Graendal is trying to get him to notice the Sharans, right? And we get all of these details about these people from across the waste, right? We learn that their rulers rule in 7-year cycles, and at the end of every 7 years, one of them dies, and then that person chooses the person who will basically succeed them. We learn that they are apparently breeding channelers, where we've kind of talked about before, the Aes Sedai are worried that they are kind of culling out the ability to channel by killing all the men. It seems like this is very deliberate on the other side of the Aiel Waste. They are breeding people who can channel, and we learn that there is kind of this hidden additional caste of people who control this whole process. And Samael hears all of this and is like, Graendal must have told me this for a reason, and then just doesn't seem to think about it any deeper. And so I'm curious, A, what were your thoughts about all of these kind of details about this kind of culture on the other side of the Aiel Waste? And B, do you have any thoughts on what Graendal might have been trying to communicate by kind of emphasizing this over and over and over throughout the conversation?
That was, to me, the most Game of Thrones moment of this, and it is kind of very literal in the sense that it's like the people beyond the wall, which felt like they were not going to be important whatsoever. It's like, oh, they're just some like scavengers up there. Don't worry about it. And then we're a kind of major part of the unfolding of a lot of later sections, and it wasn't an easy alliance and so on. And there's kind of a lot of plot built into that. And so I think I found myself debating, is that what this is? Is this, a deep tease for 5 books from now where we'll go to those places? Or kind of more in the Game of Thrones fashion, is this like an army that's going to come and do this, right? Because, the television show Game of Thrones, I didn't think replicated this exactly right. But in the books, I always had this feeling like I was really concerned about like one conflict happening in a Game of Thrones book. And then I'd be like, oh, yes. And then there's that threat and the next threat and then the next threat. And the top one was always like, and the White Walkers are on the other side of the wall, and that's like going to wipe everybody. I mean, that's the climate change metaphor people see and so on. So it kind of felt to me like, and I've used that kind of similar phrasing before. It's like, does this need to be added to our order of operations, or is this just like a little color to let us know the world exists elsewhere? We are getting a lot of hints in this book between like the Sea Folk and then, the Shan Chan being reminded, and then now this group, about how this continent is not the entirety of what's going on. And that's interesting to me. And yet I'm still not sure I'm ready to say like, well, I'm excited for in 3 books when we go there. It did just get a lot more detail, though, than your average. So I'd probably put my money on we go there or hear from those people eventually.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question of how much of this is world building versus how much of it is definitely going to kind of come back and really influence the story is a very interesting question, right? Because in George R.R. Martin, we don't really spend any time in old Valyria, but we hear about it quite a bit, and it's unclear how much Shara is going to kind of be the same sort of situation. I was trying, as you were saying this, to figure out when I can show you the world map as opposed to this continent map, and it's weird. Let me warn you about that. I think then the moment that
let me just ask before you move on, is that canonical or is that like a fan creation?
No, it's canonical. So there was an original version of it that was put out in what is kind of known as the Big White Book, which was a compendium that Robert Jordan kind of helped with but didn't write. And then later on, it turned out that his version, the version of the map he wanted, wasn't quite the same as the Big White Book. And so they actually redid a version based on his notes maybe like 5-6 years ago. So there is now like a full, accurate, canonical version of the map that's out there somewhere.
Cool. I remember at some point in recent years, I was in a bookstore and I picked up, I don't think it was the Big White Book, but some guide like that, and was like, "Can I read this?" And you're like, "No, put that down. Go away from there."
Yeah. No, I know the book you're talking about. Like a third of it describes point by point the final battle of the series. Don't go near that book. So the interesting thing from my perspective is there is a kind of dilemma I have as a reader here where I am not sure at the end of this chapter whether Graendal has told the full message to Samael, right? So Samael is very clear in this chapter. He just wants to hold Ilion. He will not attack Rand, but if Rand attacks him, he plans to kill Rand. And 3 or 4 times in this chapter, he says, Graendal, did the Dark One say that we should not kill Rand? Are there any orders you haven't told me about? Am I going to get in trouble for doing this? And she dodges the question every single time, other than when she says, I've told you everything. This means one of 2 things. Either Graendal is lying and thinks that the command, let the Lord of Chaos rule, means you shouldn't kill Rand, and that is why Graendal thinks I'm going to let Samael kill him and get in trouble for it. Or Samael has heard let the Lord of Chaos rule and is concerned that if he kills Rand, that will be a violation of that order. So this is kind of where I'm stuck, is the only thing we know the Dark One has told Demandred is let the Lord of Chaos rule, and then apparently who will live and who will die. And so Samael being so paranoid about whether he's allowed to kill Rand raises a lot of questions for me about how the Forsaken are interpreting that order.
Well, and I guess the phrasing of your question makes me think this is incorrect. But the other layer I put on it is, how guarded are these conversations being, right?
Yeah.
Like, it almost reads like a movie scene where the villain is watching on the security camera. So you say your words particularly carefully so that you want the other person to get one interpretation. You kind of hope that they do. I don't know. Maybe I saw a spy movie this week, so maybe that's just on my mind is that kind of subterfuge. But I do think that, I'm also questioning on that level whether they would want the message to come through cleanly. So that's not answering your question. That's offering a third level.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. These characters are talking past each other as much as they are talking to each other, I think, here, right? There's a little bit of code going on. I think that's exactly right. I think maybe my favorite throwaway line in this chapter is when Samael is like, well, Rand only has one army that's really loyal to him. Who would have thought the Aiel would have an army, huh? And I just thought that throwback to book 4 where we learned the Aiel used to be pacifists in the time the Forsaken were last around, I thought was kind of a fun way of referencing that really deep world building without taking you too far out of the really dark stuff that's going on in this chapter. Did you like that moment, or were there any other things that stood out to you as little moments in this chapter before we switch POVs? I think that's all I've got for Samael.
I'm not going to pretend I clocked that moment in particular, but I like your interpretation of it that you're offering. I do think, though, it's emblematic of this kind of struggle and enjoyment I get from the idea that these characters have a previous identity and are such creatures of deep time that it is hard at times to balance out what kind of mode they're in. Are they thinking about Rand as Luz, and sometimes they use the names and so on, or are they, instead thinking of the moment? And I offer that as it can be confusing and difficult, but it's also really fun because that seems to me kind of speaking to the core of this mythology, which is this idea that when these characters were here, it was a very different world. And that's really fun to imagine in your interpretation of that Aiel moment, that this is somebody who, saw a group headed in one strong direction and then time rippled outward in this crazy way that nobody expected. That's something you can't do in a lot of mythologies.
Yeah, and I think it's really fun to see Robert Jordan playing with just how deep his time is, right? How much things can change over that time span. I have one more quote that I can say absolutely nothing about, but people who are longtime book readers will hear this and immediately know that it's our first hint at something that will be resolved much later. Graendal talks about the channelers in Shara, and Demandred looks at her and says, "But do they bind themselves like criminals?" And she gives him a knowing look. And if you've read this series before, you know who binds themselves like criminals and why he is bringing that up. But, Greg, any thoughts on that before we talk about Graendal's POV?
I, of course, didn't clock that whatsoever, but intriguing and certainly something I look forward to learning about.
Excellent. We then switch to Graendal's POV, and we do learn that she was trying to get him to notice something about the Sharans, although frustratingly we don't know what. So we should be kind of keeping our eye on Shara and try to figure out what is Graendal's connection, or what is Graendal trying to hint to Samael about some sort of connection. And then we get what I think is the juiciest world-building bit here. There is a Forsaken in the White Tower. And that is something that I think is important in terms of thinking about how are we paying attention to individual Aes Sedai. We should be paying very close attention to like who could be an evil person. But I think it's also important to note this is time kind of gated. We know when this information was gotten, and it was after the split in the White Tower. So that is not to say there is not a Forsaken in Saladar, but we know there is a Forsaken in the White Tower. I just wanted to kind of clarify that. Your thoughts on that, or were there any other details in this Graendal section that stood out to you?
Well, and again, my mind is a little split between streams because we are enjoying the television show again while also reading these books from a very different point in the chronology. And it's just a reminder that, like, dang, the White Tower's been through a lot, right? You had the betrayal and the escape of the Black Aja, which led to, but is really separate from the kind of schism and the stilling of Suan. And then now we have a third major threat within that tower. And so, thinking of it as the church of this realm, the kind of sacred, holy, sacred tradition, makes you think that, like, this could still have a very strong effect, right?
Yeah.
And it could be perhaps devastating. My mind goes to the woman who's now the Amerlin seat. My mind goes to who is kind of manipulating around the corner of that. Like,
yeah,
there's lots of interesting possibilities there.
Yeah, no, and I think this is a really fun place to cross the streams, right? We try not to do it too much, but I think one of the challenges of being a first-time book reader is that the White Tower does really feel like just 800 women who you don't really know all of their names, and it's kind of opaque who is doing what. And I think that's what I like about the TV show, is it does make it a little bit easier now to be like, who is Elida? Well, she's the woman being wonderfully played by Shore Egsudlu. I think I'm saying that name roughly correct, right? Or, Suan, I think, is just Fish Lady until you've seen the television show and have a face to put on it. So I find that to be really wonderful as something you can kind of do here. As we're just talking about names. As someone who is
face blind, you find that wonderful at that. Because I do think that's true. And I was actually having that exact thought, knowing that you've been really trying to follow who the different Aes Sedai are in season 3 of the show. We really should stop talking about it too much. We need those episodes to be their own thing. But it is really helpful that we've met like 5 or 6 additional Aes Sedai. I'm like, okay, let me commit that face to memory so that when I see that name, I will think of that woman's face, or her costume even. Gives you often the color of her Aja and so on. So it is really helpful. And if people are somehow listening to this and have thought, I don't want to do that, it is helpful.
I will also just point out, I believe our first appearance of Lord Iturald comes in this chapter. That is a name that will make sense to you at some point later in these books. We then switch to Semirhage's point of view. And honestly, I think the number one thing to take away from Semirhage's point of view is do not screw around with Semirhage. Like, she is terrifying. When I remember my list of Forsaken and who they are, she is just the clinically insane one. Like, it's slightly terrifying every time we're in her POV. What was your takeaway here?
I mean, not a lot. I mean, by this point, I'm like, I'm so confused what's happening and what's going on. But I will go back to what you said in that it is very clear this is a different flavor of darkness, right?
Yeah.
And I don't even know if I would go like to Heath Ledger's Joker. It's like it's even more unhinged in some way, right?
Yeah.
It's like a true psychopath.
Yeah, that's just it. I think that like Heath Ledger's Joker, or the other one that I always think of is like Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men, right? They are so kind of devastating as villains because they are just unhinged from what you expect of them, but they have a code. And the thing about Semirhage is I think she just likes hurting people and kind of doesn't have a code, and that's somehow much more terrifying. It is worth noting the only reason she is doing this is because she is being directed by Shaidar Heron, which is essentially being directed by the Dark One. So I think we do want to be really cautious about like what details do we have about where she is and why she's doing what she's doing, because this is our best clue to what is the Dark One's plan, as opposed to what is the Dark One telling the Forsaken, which may be, as several of them have thought, some sort of misdirection or a way to pit them against each other. So what were your kind of thoughts about what she is trying to do here, or kind of Shaidar Heron being the one directing whatever is happening?
Have to help me with my memory. This is the Forsaken pinpricking the parts of the brain.
That is correct. So Semirhage is the Forsaken pinpricking the parts of the brain. Shaidar Heron is the extra large merdrail that we met in the prologue that apparently basically speaks for the Dark One, since the Dark One can't leave Shaiel Ghul.
The mouth of Sauron.
Yes.
Oh, yes. So what was striking to me in this was just, this was the power on a hugely different level, right? Like, you know, we've thought about the devastation of being able to like shake the continent and break the world, but we haven't thought about the like fine pinpricking of a part of your brain, right?
Yeah.
And I'm talking too much Star Wars tonight, but this often comes up for me because it's like, they don't quite know how to define this across Star Wars mythology. Like, a Jedi can come up on a locked door, and it's like, well, if you are so good at, you know, telekinesis, you should be able to reach in and manipulate the equivalent of the tumblers and get through it, but they can't. And so
it's the why don't Jedi press the button on their opponent's lightsabers question, right? That seems like a thing you can easily do with the Force.
Yeah, and so I thought that, well, I guess with all that being said, it made me a little nervous that we're establishing that somebody has this level of power, because, you know, why wouldn't you just, like, you know, grab an artery and close it, right? Like, you know, still a heart from across the room. Now, I don't know that it worried me too much because, again, this is somebody who's meant to be on a different scale, right? If this was just like some cool Aes Sedai we met in the tower, I'd be like, wait a minute, like this is just accessible. But I do think it works because it's so far beyond what our characters should be kind of aimed towards.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I do want to point out here really quickly that Semirhage knows so much about the inner workings of like the brain and, like you said, like arteries and all of that. I think it's really kind of ironic that this is something that exists in a world where Nynaeve right now is begging one of the Forsaken to tell her about healing, and she's getting nothing. Right? I read this chapter and I was imagining, what if Nynaeve had Semirhage in her hands instead of Moghedien, and it would be night and day. She would be able to cure cancer in an hour with this kind of power, right? And so that's what it immediately got me thinking about, is you went to the dark side of it. I went to the light side of, ooh, I want to see what happens when someone who wants to fix things gets this kind of power.
Well, and it also, the way you just talked about that made me think of, it's always misattributed, but I think it's Asimov originally saying, you know, any science sufficiently advanced appears as magic. So that feels exactly like what we might be talking about here. It looks like magic, but could it be some kind of science?
I think I only have one other note here, which is that when you see a torture scene and literally only one piece of information comes out of the torture, it's probably an important piece of information. We should keep the name Cabriana Mercandes on our minds. She is a Aes Sedai who was somewhere alone and just lost her warder and is now being tortured in a way that Semirhage is concerned might leave her a broken husk. So I think that's a name to be keeping an eye out for. Someone's going to be looking for her at some point. Is she a Tower Aes Sedai who's going to be missing? Was she with one of the groups of embassies that we know are making their way from place to place? This is a name we should be kind of, whenever it shows up, it should set off big red lights as, okay, this is a place that we know the Forsaken are muddling around. Were there any last thoughts you have on kind of this very dark chapter before next week? We only have one chapter, but let me tell you, the word Elaine is in the first 4 or 5 words, so I think we might get to the plot line you were excited about a couple of weeks ago, maybe see what's going on in Saladar. What are your thoughts on what came and what's coming next?
Mostly I'm just relieved that you said that's a name we should look forward to, not a name we were supposed to remember, which is mainly where my head is at as we close out this episode. You know, again, I think, as I said to you yesterday and I said to start this episode, like this is tough going. And to me, that feels like where a series needs to be kind of this phase in. Like, we have to start challenging readers and pushing beyond what we're comfortable with and continuing to expand. Again, it's not always exactly right, but it feels like you spend the first 2/3 of a fantasy series kind of expanding and growing, and then you collapse it all a little quicker than the journey to expanding it all. So
yeah,
that feels like we're doing good natural things. I was just very surprised by kind of how foreign this felt. But we'll see. My next question becomes, is this like a one and done in this book, or is this a group we continue to go back to and check in with? Kind of feels more like the former, but we'll see. But I guess not next time, when we will be reading Chapter 7.
I thought you were just about to say the name of the podcast. It was like, stop, the chapter name.
So Chapter 7, A Matter of Thought, looks like a solid, actually an exactly 30 pages in my mass market paperback edition. So we are sticking to the one for next week, but we hope you read it. We hope you enjoy. We hope you also took notes on the names of the Forsaken. Make sure you're catching up on that TV show. If you are going back to the first 2 seasons for a rewatch, throw on our episodes. We'll rewatch with you. And then we will start making sure we record for the new season. Tyler has not said this on air, I don't think. Maybe he has. But word on the internet tubes is that the show is kind of on the bubble. So if you have friends,
watch it 800 times.
Get it in there. Just leave your Prime accounts playing when you're out doing errands. They don't know and they don't care. Every time I maybe abuse Tyler's thing, but there's a new feature on at least my smart TV that now the Amazon specifically Amazon ads will say like, hey, you want an email about this? We'll throw you that information. So I think people should say yes, because then we'll make Wheel of Time fans look like a really purchase forward, attractive audience.
Do it.
Yeah, absolutely. In the past, when shows of mine have been in danger of getting canceled, I at some point did start emailing advertisers as a part of like an internet campaign that was like, I wasn't going to buy a Rolex, but now that you advertised on my favorite television show, I'm really considering it. So yes, do that. Do all the things. Do them all this week, and then we'll see you next week through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.